And it's really a joy to have Professor Clorinda Donato here from California State University at Long Beach, where she was for many years the Grazie a Dio chair in Italian studies, as well as professor of Italian and French. And she's now the director of the Clorinda Donato Center for Global Romance Languages and Translation Studies. And this is going to be a short introduction. First, because I've lost my voice, as you can hear. And second, because a full-length introduction or full-length account of Professor Donato's research career, publications, would take far too long. She's an eminent 18th century specialist in Italian and French studies and beyond, Swiss and various others. She is a fellow scholar in Italian American studies and in translation studies, as well as a translator, I should say as well. And she's a leading researcher and practitioner in intercomprehension and language learning. And if you want to know more about that, there is a talk tomorrow, which is going to take place in the Melville Library at the Center for Italian Studies in Melville East 4340 between 12:30 and 1:50, and which is talking precisely about that, teaching languages through intercomprehension, a conversation with Clorinda. It's going to be an informal talk. She is, amongst other things, one of the authors of this fantastic textbook, which is called Juntos, which is the first really important textbook produced here in the United States about how to teach Romance languages across, so Italian to Hispanophones, French to Italophones, and so on. But most of all, Clorinda, and in that context that Agnes was talking about, in the context, in the landscape that is shifting around us, and that requires vision and requires leadership. Clorinda is a leader, an innovator, a thinker, as well as a teacher and a mentor of colleagues, and she is a great speaker, and I'm honored to count her as a friend as well. So today she is talking to us about seeing the literary text through Voyant, digital tools in literary translation. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you, everybody who invited me here today. It's a real honor to be speaking in a center devoted to multilingualism. I wish we had one on our campus, because multilingualism deserves visibility more than ever. And so I applaud you all. Somebody will tell me maybe later how you were able to get this center started, but it is really a great thing. So my talk today, I'm going to talk about a course that I teach, that I've taught once, and the places it's taken me and how I'm looking forward to teaching it again, but also why I was interested in teaching literary translation using digital tools. And so I'm going to be, because I want to be able to see this here, so I'm going to be advancing these things, that good, like that, and I'll be changing glasses. But anyway, so the literary translator seeks to understand as much as possible about the source text and source languages before translating, not to mention the means of revising the translation through informed comparative analysis of the source and translated text. So these web-based analytical tools are really useful from this point of view. I mean, think of them as ways to understand in more granular detail the texts that you are going to be translating or working with or analyzing. I mean, what I think is exciting about these tools is that they're not just useful for literary translators, but what I found in working with my students, that these tools allowed them to see the text more clearly and to understand what aspects of the text had made it a famous text or had made it stick with them. And you'll see some of those examples. My presentation will feature examples from Chinese, French, German, Japanese, Russian, Spanish, Italian, and Somali. I teach a literary translation I teach 2 literary translation classes. They are the theory and practice of literary translation, that's RGR, which stands for Romance, German, Russian, except it's not limited to Romance. We're undergoing sort of a restructuring, which we need to do because students from other languages come into my courses too. And then I added this new course, Translation Studies 410, 510, Literary Translation in Transit, and that's the one I will mainly be talking to you about today. But just to compare the 2 classes, so in the theory and practice of literary translation, we work with Lawrence Venuti's wonderful The Translation Studies Reader, which I'm very excited that he has added many new theoreticians to this work. He's finally added Asian theoreticians, and I have to say that this was a great addition to the class the last time I taught it, that it really opened us outside of European theories, and especially the students greatly appreciated that. But I'm not here to really talk about that class, but I just wanted to show you that these are the 2 classes on literary translation. And then I created this class basing it on this textbook that you can see here, using computers in the translation of literary style, challenges and opportunities. And I became fascinated with this book as I looked at it. Now, to give you some background here, we started this translation center, and I hired people who are very different from me, people who are psycholinguists, who do audiovisual translation, people who are also have one foot in industry. They're using technology. They're using these platforms. That's what the students need to be trained on. We want them to have, it's tough. They have to have really good language skills, and they have to have really good technology skills. And then I started to think, well, if my students need those skills, what about me? What am I bringing to the table? And so I discovered this textbook, and I started working with it, and immediately loved what it was about, that it was talking about close reading. So close reading is, of course, very important, but also distant reading, the Franco Moretti idea of really crunching lots of texts. How much do we really know about in a particular place and time where the interest and emphasis in culture as expressed in literature was, if we're only focusing on close readings of one novel. I'm an 18th century person, so what if I were only reading, Voltaire's Candide? But what about all the other things he wrote? And what about all the other things people wrote in reaction to him? And so this idea of distant reading is really important. That doesn't mean we don't need the close reading, but we need to bring these 2 things together. And these were the kinds of things that I liked when I read Roy Udale's book about how he was bringing those things together. And so we started, I created this new course that consists of 2 interrelated parts: the introduction to the applications of technology and literary translation, following the strategies outlined in the textbook, using computers in literary translation. And then 2, the students worked on a translation project. This is taken from my syllabus. That was accompanied by a translator's preface and their commentary on how the computer tools help them make the best choices in their translations. And so that's what we'll be talking about. So, but just to back up a minute, again, as I was saying, why would a professor of literature and literary translation begin teaching digital competencies and digital humanities tools in her literary translation classes, creating a new class? I was saying a little bit about that a minute ago, but it really has a lot to do with my daily reading of the Chronicle of Higher Education as well. And again, how can you miss the growing importance of digital competencies for our students? And I was particularly struck by a survey done on the student view of digital competencies. This was a survey about the range of practices and knowledge, a range of practices, knowledge, including basic computer skills, online content creation, information analysis, data analytics, and coding. Things that I, hear my students who are in computer science talk about, but that I started to realize I needed to become conversant with as well. And so the survey said that 8 in 10 students say digital skills should be a bigger part of their college curriculum. And I do believe that this is a shortcoming of what is going on currently in most departments of language and literature. We're not paying attention to these digital skills. And 8 in 10 say teaching such skills will attract students to college. 9 in 10 say college is where they expect to acquire the skills that the workplace increasingly demands. And 5 in 10 say the skills will make them better prepared for the job market. I don't know why only 5 in 10 said that, but anyway, but you can see that this is important. So what is the challenge? How can we embed these skills into the traditional courses that we teach? And so I tried to take up that challenge, especially because I'm surrounded by younger colleagues I hired who are doing some of these things. And I thought, well, I better figure this out. And so I started to become interested in how I could reinforce the current content. This doesn't mean that we've developed a knowledge base through our more traditional kinds of research, but there is a way to invigorate it with new perspectives, and that's what I was definitely interested in doing. So a lot stays the same in this course, right? First of all, in a literary translation course, students need to know languages and literatures. And 2, in terms of language, they should have third-year reading competency at least. Although I do have a few students with only 2 years, and we have adjusted quite well using proofreaders. That is one of the things that's very good about having a translation studies center. We have funding to hire proofreaders. So obviously, as you're going to see, I had a student working in Mandarin, I had a student working in Japanese, and I hired proofreaders to work with them, translators who were actually very excited to work with students, because many translators and interpreters, they're working very much on their own. It can be a kind of lonely job, and they're very excited to work with students. But that's another coordination piece. But of course, I learn a lot from it, and you'll see some of the things there that I've learned. And then in terms of literature, they should know literary genre, basic literary terminology, and something about literary history. That's not always the case, but what I discovered in teaching with these methods is that they were more interested in finding those things out because there was a direct correlation between issues of literary history and the using of the technology, and we'll see that. Now, one of the things that Udale's book is very focused on is how do we understand what it is about a writer's style that makes that work so unique, right? And so an appreciation for style, which we all want this appreciation for style when we read, we go, I love this writer's style. But if you wanted to quantify, what is it about that style that is really making it work? You go, well, I just like it, or I like this, or I like that. And so here we get to try to do some things that allow us to actually really dig deep and say, well, this style is working because the sentences are short. The vocabulary is very much focused on dynamic verbs or things like that. So we start to really go into what we're talking about when we're talking about style. And so it's important, style, because it focuses on what is said, but how it is said. And we are often, with students, we're like, well, what was this book about? What is the kind of plot summary? But it's how is it said that makes it great. It's how it's said that draws us to it. It draws us to literature, right? As Terry Eagleton remarks, literary writing is the kind of writing in which content is inseparable from the language in which it is represented, and we want to be able to get that back. Language is constitutive of the reality or experience rather than simply a vehicle for it. If style is important to literature, what is unique to a text? So this style of the source text is going to have a huge bearing on the shape of the translated text, on the shape of the target text, right? And so by having students understand that they're not just going to throw themselves in and start translating, that they're going to have to understand things about the text that will lead them to making decisions that will have to do with the ways in which the two languages are different to come to produce the same effect. Now they've got a very different kind of task before them. And what is really interesting is that it's a task with a kind of concrete, what's going on with my thing here? With a very kind of concrete outcome. They've got something that they've got to do. And so now there's a motivation factor that we very often don't have, right? What's different is that the structure of the class is flipped. We began with a set of research questions that came out of our textbook. So once I have chosen a text to translate, what digital tools will allow me to see the stylistic features that make it unique? How do these tools work together with my close reading of the text? What do I need to know before I begin translating? I don't know why this stopped here going, but I'll just do it this way. In terms of terminology, we're talking about close reading with corpus linguistics and text visualization tools and techniques in the process of literary translation. The close and distant reading approach, CDR, is contextualized by looking at the development and current use of the two most widely adopted translation technologies, computer-aided translation, CAT tools, and machine translation. And then if we want to talk about what is distant reading, I'm sure that most people in this room know what that is, a term coined by Franco Moretti to refer to the process of, quote, understanding literature not by studying particular texts, but by aggregating and analyzing massive amounts of data. and this has been at the center of data conversations in the humanities for a long time, but I think we're still working through it, because if somebody had said this to me before I read this textbook, I wouldn't have known. I go, well, that's a good idea, but what do I do with that, right? And then whereas close reading relies on analysis about the apparent inner workings of a single text, distant reading takes account of hundreds and even thousands of compositions. But I want to emphasize the fact that we need both. And so we have the translators. What is the translator's skill set, right? And the translator's skill set is to that of identifying solutions to translation problems, right? And selecting between available solutions. This comes from Anthony Pym, one of the great theoreticians and practitioners of translation, and that literary style is fundamentally based on patterns of language use, and a pattern is essentially repetition. So how are we identifying what those patterns are, right? And that is something that is significantly aided by the use of technology. Repetition in naturally occurring conversations is transient, it's fleeting. It may have no perceptive effect, or its effects may not be ascribed to the repetition itself. In other words, it is not noticed. And so what is happening a lot of times as we're reading literary texts, we're not noticing a lot of the things about them. And this was really surprising to me and to the students as we took this journey together. I'll be teaching this course again next year. So this is kind of, it's pretty fresh, but I was very amazed at how much I learned in just one semester. And of course, we know that computers are good at detecting linguistic patterns and presenting them for analysis, right? Computers can reveal hidden layers of information. That's one of the things we're interested in. And the more stylistic information a translator has at their disposal, the greater the likelihood that they will understand how the text has created its effects and how to attempt to recreate them. Again, this approach uses these complementary methods, distant and close reading, right? Close reading retains the ability to read the source text without dissolving its structure. Distant reading does exactly the opposite. And so they're actually quite complementary. So the approach concentrates on the use of CL, corpus linguistics, and text visualization tools, which in some cases are beginning to converge. The use of corpus linguistics and text visualization in CDR is consciously designed to support and enhance the literary translator's creativity by maximizing the amount of stylistic and frequently narratological information they have at their disposal. And it can be used in three ways. It can be used to analyze the source text after and even during the initial reading. So you've got your source text. So this is it also when you're working with students who are doing translation, you have to remind them sometimes, maybe you should read the text before you start translating it, right? It might be a good idea because I just want to start translating. No, read it. But when you have to do some of these tasks, you really are forced to read it or to read it while you're doing them. And that's what most of the students did. Or it can be helpful with your first draft of the translation. So there are different points in the translation process in which these tools can also be used. You can also compare the source text and the draft translation with a view to seeing if certain translation goals have been achieved and what has happened in the translation process. And then you can also engage in the auto-analysis of translator style. That can be done at any time. It maybe yields more results after a translator has completed several translations, but those are some of the things. So corpora and their creation. So we can't think of corpora as just giant dictionaries. Their corpora is much more than that. Parallel corpora differ from bilingual dictionaries since the latter are repertoires of lexical equivalents. But parallel corpora are repertoires of strategies deployed by past translators as well as repertoires of translation equivalents. But the other kinds of corpora that a literary translator can profit from are those they create themselves. And so you'll see some of the things that my students did when they decided, for example, what a particular writer was using and talking about, whether it was folk tales or science fiction. Then they started to look at the corpora of those disciplines and want to include those in the corpus that they were creating for their own translation. Now, one of these, so I'm talking mainly about Voyant, but I also used a tool called Sketch Engine, and that allows students to upload their own documents and then automatically compiles them into a fully searchable corpus. And so the students used Sketch Engine to do that. Voyant does that now too, but at the time that I taught the course, it didn't. These tools are also, they're evolving. I imagine that when I teach this course next year, I'm gonna have to start all over again because, and there's other ones too, right? But Voyant and Sketch Engine still seem to be the most user friendly. So what the students did, these were their assignments. What would you want to feed into a CAT tool to train it for your translation? That was their task. And for Japanese, I had two students working on the tale of Genji. Excuse me if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. I had a Russian student working on Fathers and Sons, which has recently been retranslated to Fathers and Children by Turgenev. I had this was they hadn't yet chosen their own text. This was for them to experiment with, right? The French students worked with Alain Mabancou's Mémoire du Porc Épine. The Spanish students, of which there are more Spanish students, as you can imagine, in Southern California. I had three groups. I had a group working with Los Recuerdos del Porvenir, de Elena Garro, The Death of Artemio Cruz by Carlos Fuentes, and The House of Bernarda Alba by Federico Garcia Lorca. So I had two students working on the French assignment of corpora for translating Porc Épic by Mabancou, and they started to look at monolingual corpora, right? And they got interested in proverbs and fables, realizing that he used a lot of those. So that was something that they wanted to put into their corpus, right? Notes on folklore. They realized that these are books that he had used, right? Where Animals Talk, West African folklore tales. They fed that in. And then Traduction des romans africains francophones de la dichotomie à la triade by Natalia Nayadova. And again, by researching Mabancou, they discovered all these books. Now, what was so interesting is, you know, if you told the students, oh, here's Alain Mabancou, go do some research about him, they go, no, I'm not. But they had a task to do. So they were like totally motivated. They went out and found, and they made oral presentations about what they had found, right? They also discovered that Mabancou loves Edgar Allan Poe. So they started to look at Edgar Allan Poe to try to figure out what is it in Mabanku that is like Edgar Allan Poe. He also likes Hemingway and the fables by Fontaine and Flora and Fauna, and then Congo life and folklore, because he's from Congo, right? So all of a sudden they're way branching out into the cultural context of Mabanku, and they felt very prepared then for maybe experimenting their translation. So with Fathers and Children with Turgenev, I had a student from Russian and a student from German, but she also was a student of Russian, and so these were the kinds of things they put together for their corpora, and again working with what was going on in Turgenev's lives, and they really started to understand what kinds of sources they should be looking at. A major liberal magazine of the 19th century. Anyway, they put all these things together. I'm going to have to start going fast here because I realize I'm running out of time already. What time do you want me to stop?
You have to continue. Don't worry about time.
Oh, really? Okay. Okay. And then the Spanish assignment. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go. Good. Thank you. La muerte de Artemio Cruz. Okay. Now this was very interesting, and of course, for so many of my students who are of Mexican origin, you can imagine where we are. This was a book that many of them had read, but they hadn't really gone that much into, the background of that text and the Mexican Revolution and the development of the Institutional Revolutionary Party. And they said they learned so much about their own heritage by doing this and learning about his political background. They also became very interested in how important Orson Welles' Citizen Kane was. Did I skip something here? Oh. Yeah, how important Orson Welles was for Fuentes, and many of them had seen the film Citizen Kane, but they'd never thought about influences, contemporary influences in Fuentes' life, and all of a sudden this echoing effect for them made this. A lot of them said, we went back and watched Citizen Kane. We became really interested in this. Now, you also have military and religious terminology, and so they started to look at pieces for the corpus that they could add to the on military and religious terminology, which when you read the book, there's a lot of military, I read it during the pandemic, and there was a lot of religious and military terminology, and you can kind of get lost in it, but it gives you an appreciation for what he's doing when you understand what's happening there. Now, Los Recuerdos del Porvenir of Elena Garro. This was very interesting because the students discovered that she was the wife of Octavio Paz. And they said, how come we always study Octavio Paz, but none of our professors ever told us that his wife was this person named Elena Garro, who is just as important as he was. So, the women in the class were really irate, and they went back to their Spanish professors and said, we want to read Elena Garro, So this was, again, fascinating. And again, they did this, they went through, I'm going to try to go a little more quickly here, but she was very interested in the indigenous languages, in Nahuatl, and phraseology coming from the cultural and social context and the jargon of today. So that gave them another whole different kind of corpora to put together. and this is really exciting for them. The jargon of Guerrero, Mexico slang, and indigenous languages. So now they're we're not, because they're all of a sudden they're realizing, oh, I can't just think about Spanish. Now I've got to think about all of these things. But it was very exciting to them because many of them also speak indigenous languages. And so this really was more reflective of their experience than they thought. So again, Guerra Cristera y Revolución Mexicana. And it just, again, the access, the other thing was how exciting it was for them to present these to each other. So think about, this is like, the students are presenting these texts to each other, and everybody's learning about all of these different texts, right? And then we have Lorca and Bodas de Sangre. So, oh no, it was the House of Bernarda Alba. And now we've got a very Spanish text as well. We have Lorca as a young writer, and again, the context within which he was working, and somehow or another, am I messing this up here? Yeah, there we go. You know, the whole context of the Spanish avant-garde. And again, this was very exciting for them. Now, let's look at, here's a provisional plot structure of a model for applying CDR to the process of literary translation. And so you're trying to analyze the source text from a narratological, lexical, grammatical, and context and cohesion, all of these different perspectives. And you know, and here you have, this comes from the textbook, right? But it was so useful for the students because these seem to them more concrete than anything we usually do when we're teaching literature is. They're like, oh, okay, like, well, the plot structure, the character names, they could actually go through. Now they had what seemed like concrete tasks to address, or lexical, grammatical, etc. What is it grammatically that this author's doing or not, right? And then part two, as they're preparing to translate, there's the follow-up stage one, doing standard analyses, setting translation goals. And so they're going through all of these steps as they're preparing to do their own translation, which they have picked, okay? And so again, this is just about the close reading, and we've already actually looked at that quote about what's retaining the structure and how we're dissolving it, and both of those things are working together. Now, this is I'm going to talk briefly here about the student translation project of English to Chinese. This was a story from the New Yorker called Snowstorm by Bruna Dantas Lobado. And my student was using, so here you see the source text she was translating, and the target, the translation, and then the translation done with machine translation. Now, she had gone through and done these analyses, etc. And these areas that are highlighted in red were areas that I'm sorry, thank you. I'm so glad you're helping me here because I'm trying, right. You can see why though I need to see it in front of me because otherwise I'd be like this the whole time, you know. And so this was very interesting as she was going through and realizing things that needed attention. And so like here she explains modified translation according to context. You know, this goes on. She talks about some of the kinds of things she had to do, wrong expression. Some of these are also the comments done by the Chinese translator who reviewed her translation. Here he says, I like the word you chose, or Chinese culture, not sure. And so this dialogue between the translator, the expert translator, and Dana, my student, was very productive. She felt she learned so much by having these questions, by having run this through Voyant and Sketch Engine, but she also makes comments about you know, so here we have about the pros and cons of machine translation versus, you know, her own personal translation. So they had to analyze that too, right? What was good about the machine part? What was good about being able to go back and forth and do both? We shouldn't be afraid of the machine translation. It's something that helps us, but we need to be leery of it. And so here we start to see some of the so here you can see her translation, you know, she found the machine translation on emotionless, full of emotion, no localization, understand culture for both source and target text. She did such a good job of analyzing all of our critiques of machine translation, but here she really experienced it, right? And she was discussing it in class, and she was discussing it with her, or the proofreader, right? Now here we're going to take a look at a Voyant screen, and so these are the ways in which Voyant we're all used to these word clouds, right? We're putting in the text, and it's telling us what the most common words are. We're eliminating the words that would normally be the most common, but, right? There's ways to eliminate those. But there's a lot of ways that we can adjust what we're doing so that we can get very precise information. Now, this is her comment on Chinese and Voyant. For Chinese language recognition, Voyant needs improvement. In the Cirrus analysis, Voyant generated some strange characters in the word cloud with the Chinese target text. I chose the Kaiti font from Word to save my Chinese target text in Notepad as TXT format. It would be helpful if Voyant designates specific Chinese font for uploading to avoid wrong recognition of Chinese characters. On the other hand, it is interesting to see the consistency of high-frequency words analysis in Cirrus and trend for both English source text and Chinese target text, such as said and room. And then she attached all of her figures, right? This was the assignment that they had. Right. Using the Voyant tool, do the following. Experiment further with Voyant and report on all of the functions you have explored. What did you think of them? How might you use them? And then upload the text you were translating and run at least 3 different reports using them here. And so this is what they did. Now, This was one that was from German. It was an untranslated short story by Christa Wolf. And it's a novella called Moscow Novella. And this was very interesting because this student really had a number of breakthroughs with this, oh, thank you, right? That when she read the text, she had somehow she said, I missed the importance of this character, Vera. And she said, and I realized that I didn't like Vera when I read this story. And so I just blotted her out. But when I saw this word cloud, I realized that I couldn't just ignore Vera. I had to spend a lot more time thinking about her. And she said, so this completely, jolted me that I could have been so subjective and that I wasn't having an objective approach to the text, right? And so, and here you can see Vera trending, right? She couldn't really ignore it. Thank you. Here you see Vera is trending, right? So, and this was really exciting, and it's often very interesting how many of these texts have never been translated. Somebody as famous as Christa Wolf, right? Here's more of her analyses. Down here we see most frequent words in the corpus: Vera, 39 times Pavel, 14 times Moscow, 12 times Platz, 11, Walter, 10. But that really had to make her think about the role, the importance that even in her translation then she had to give as she was doing her translation. And then, here, this is the high frequency words. We're back here to the source text of English and the target text in Chinese, and the high frequency words, whether they're the same or whether they're different. Now, in the Chinese text, the word mom, oh, thank you, came up as high frequency, but not in the English text. And so that might make us want to ask ourselves, what do I need to go back and do something? Look at that, Now, this is another thing that Voyant does for you. It gives these text bubbles, so it features the visual representation of how often relevant terms appear in my text. So you can see how big the bubble is or how small. And then I just wanted to bring this up. I found this fascinating, that a student wanted to reflect on Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis with Voyant, because she said, after she did this, she goes, lastly, I attempted to use the tool with Franz Kafka's Metamorphosis, a story I read many years ago, but that left quite an impression on me. I remember the feelings the story left me with, but didn't think much about what themes or greater meanings the author may have been writing about. After uploading the text, the major words found were all about the main character, his family, and his room. Comparing this information through the different tools helped to visualize a quick and desperate desire to escape a prison of sorts and jailers, the relatives. And so I thought it was interesting that she wanted to go back to something she had read and understand why she liked it so much, and used Voyant in that way. Now, Sketch Engine is the other tool we used. It contains 1 trillion words in 800 ready-to-use corpora in 100 plus languages. It's incredibly powerful. One of the things I want to do is actually take a class on Voyant. I mean, I did most of this on my own. They had a tutorial that you could use, but of course, if you needed to invest more money in the bigger set of things. But I thought, for what we're doing, it's enough to have this short tutorial. But this is something I would like to try to do before I teach with this again. I'm going to go through here quickly to there's some of the critiques of the students, but the Russian student did a very good, I'm sorry for doing this, but he translated this short story called The Warrior's Last Joke, and he did a very good analysis of what it was that when he compared Voyant and Sketch Engine, and thought that Sketch Engine gave him more depth, and that the corpora worked a little bit better. If you look here at point 4, he says, my favorite was the Ngrams tool. This tool allows you to see a list of multi-word phrases that appear frequently together. It allows you to filter a range between 2 and 6 word phrases for Russian. And he says, I found 2 to 4 word phrases to be the most useful and fruitful with colloquialisms. And it then pulls the frequency of those. He liked the Ngrams tool better, and felt that it helped him more, especially because he is still a student of Russian. And so they also compared, I won't read through all of these, but they compared the format, the way Voyant and Sketch Engine allowed you to visualize. Some of them liked certain features of Voyant, some liked certain features of Sketch Engine. And what I wanted to say is that it was the last point here is very useful. It would not be a bad idea to use both in tandem. Again, the students were so comfortable. Once they started doing this, they were more comfortable with it than I was, right? Because this to them seemed familiar to work with these tools, yet it allowed them to develop more of the kinds of traditional reading skills that I value. And so let's look at the takeaways. The project-based nature of the class keeps students moving between content and process. They learn through problem solving from the beginning. They ask, what is my research question? And this has given them an impetus to achieve. They're starting with questions that they have to answer, but they have a set of tools they get to use as they answer them. The emphasis is on skill building, not grade seeking. That seemed to liberate them so much. I said, here we're looking at the skill sets you're working on. People are at different levels because some of the students had their language skills weren't as good as they should have been, but I have to say that those students were, I had one Japanese student, can you imagine, she'd only had 1 year of Japanese. She was so motivated after this class, she ended up applying to that program to work abroad in Japan, and she got accepted. And, she's written to me and said, this motivated me to acquire that level of Japanese because I saw that there were many ways of going at it, not just sitting in front of this textbook day and night. And then the fact that we were all learning together. I think that they loved the fact that I was learning along with them, and that this was really a collaborative course. At this time, I also had an expert on these things, Diana Roix-Sanz, came and gave 3 lectures on digital tools for translation, and she was able to also speak about both Voyant and Sketch Engine, and that was also very, very valuable. So I ended up inviting a very different kind of person to lecture in the class than I normally would have. Again, on the takeaways, as an instructor, my mindset has been very different from what it was in teaching other courses. Because so much was new, planning was done organically and changed to accommodate the new pedagogical directions. And then like I said here, I invited guest lecturers who spoke about using digital tools. This was very exciting because they were very familiar, and so the students got to hear other people who use these tools regularly in their own teaching and scholarship. And then looking forward, I can't wait to do it again. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I can't wait to do this again. I want to take a digital course for mastering the tools. I was surprised at how quickly I was actually able to learn to work with these tools by experimenting, and that training for faculty is so important, but it can be the hardest problem to address because I don't think our universities are doing a very good job of helping us move in this direction at all. I mean, and I'm not gonna lie, I felt very lonely at times. If it hadn't been for this resource person, Diana, who was like my mentor, I'd write to her, I'm like, Diana, she'll say, calm down, it's okay. But those kinds of things, you know, this isn't something that my academic computing office can help me with. I need an expert who's doing these things to work with me, and then not to be afraid to, but the textbook is huge. His textbook is fantastic. Now, looking forward from class to research article, and I'm actually not going to be able to talk about that because there's not time, but I will tell you that with one of the people who was in the class and myself, and she's now doing a PhD with this resource person, and myself were co-directing her thesis on Afro-Italian women writers, and we have written an article called Refractions of Post-Colonial Identity, Uba Cristina Ali Farah's Somali-Italian Style in English and French translation, and that we analyzed the source text of her first novel called Madre Piccola, Little Mother, in the source text in French and in English. And to just end, I want to tell you that this was so eye-opening because we allowed us to see how the translators were very much affected by certain cultural discourses going on in their countries at the time. And for example, the translation of the word negro, right? So in the Italian text, the word appears many times. And in the English text, it's almost reduced to nothing. The word is changed because of the cultural connotations. And the same in French, although French was kind of in between English and Italian. And so these kinds of things, like looking at the words, looking at how many, the Italian text uses a lot of Somali words. It was very interesting that the French translator got rid of a lot of them. And we have a whole analysis about why that is, but it's too long to go into now. But whereas the English text was more respecting of incorporating the Somali words and a glossary. The Italian text had a glossary. French text would not put in a glossary and just substituted the words. But that's a pretty big difference. And you have to look at the way in which post-colonial literature, Francophonie, the way it's the Francosphere is being addressed today in France. And so, but from what I've just presented about my students, I think you can see the value of using these kinds of texts for comparing translations, because they allow you again to go very granularly into cultural issues and provide concrete evidence of why certain translators have discovered certain solutions, and why their translations are reflective of their own cultural situation and biases. So thank you very much for your attention.